Hi, and welcome to the first in the work sampling video series. You can see the agenda here on the slide. This first video, we're going to describe what work sampling is, how it fits into work measurement, and how to set up a work study procedure, which you'll be doing and conducting for your project or for some other topic if you can't find it appropriate for your project. Then the second video will explain advantages and disadvantages of work sampling, and then we'll have a problem that probably will break into two videos. So let's go ahead and get started and describe what work sampling is. So we know that work sampling, we've heard about that in our summary when we started talking about work measurement, where we have direct time study, methods time measurement or predetermined time studies, standard data, and work sampling. I don't like work sampling for repetitive, short-term type of task like we use direct time study, predetermined time studies, and standard data. What work sampling is for is to look at broad categories of types of work or types of activities. And so you can see the examples here. We would have the subject, so are we going to be doing our work sampling of workers or machines, for example, and we would then break that down into different types of categories. So for a machine, for example, we might be setting up a machine, as you can see here in the slide, producing parts or idle. From the video that you watched that described a work sampling study in a hospital about nurses' time, they broke it into the categories. So again, it was with the person, looked at time with a patient, time the nurse was doing paperwork, time they were communicating, and there were some other categories there as well. Another type of activity, if work sampling is not going to be appropriate for your project, you can do something around campus here and look at maybe classroom activities. So when you look in a classroom, how often is the instructor giving a lecture using the board, how often using PowerPoint, how often are the students working on individual work on their own, how often on group work. So you can see numerous different examples for what the subject is, either machine or person, or this could be person or the room. You could look at it from the teacher point of view, I guess, or the student or the room itself. This is probably a teacher point of view here. And then the different types of categories that we have. So what makes work sampling interesting, I guess, is it's a statistical technique. So unlike direct time study, where we have to be continuously observing and recording the data, with work sampling, we're going to take observations, just single observations at random times over the time period that we conduct the study. And the time period that we must conduct the study needs to be long enough so it will cover typical activities that are performed by the subject, whether the subject is a machine, the nurse, what the teacher does in the classroom. So for example, if we were going to, let's just pick on classroom activities, if we were going to perform a work sampling procedure, do you think the period of the study, 1 day would be enough? And let's say that 1 day is the first day of the term. Do you think that that is going to provide an accurate representation of the activities that happen in a classroom over the course of a quarter? Probably not, right? Do you need to do it over the course of the whole quarter? Who knows? Maybe if you have the time that you could spend on it, but maybe just a week that's representative. Probably not during finals week, right? Because everyone is just doing individual work during finals during that time. So we might need to think about what the appropriate time would be and how long that needs to be. But we want to have the period long enough so that we get a good representation of the activities that are performed by whatever subject we're looking at. Okay. And why don't you think about how this is related to productivity? So when you look at the types of categories here, you can see setting up a machine, producing parts, or idle, for example. So we can see from our work sampling procedure how much of the time is value added, producing parts, how much of the time is non-value added, idle, and how much of time is maybe non-value added but necessary setting up the machine. So we'd look at the percentages of time spent in each of these categories and then be able to make some further analysis and study. This isn't going to tell us a solution to the problem, but it would tell us kind of where to start looking and go do some further data collection analysis. Okay, so that's work sampling defined. And then when is it appropriate? So when we have time to perform the study. So like I said, it needs to go over several weeks, if not a month or so that we get all the appropriate activities captured in our data collection. When we have multiple subjects. So if I have a group of machines, then I can do a work sampling procedure because I can go out and get one observation or one visit to that area of the floor, take observations about all the equipment, and then have that happen each time that I go around. So when there are multiple subjects, or for the nurses, there were multiple nurses. So instead of just studying one nurse, we could see what the collection of nurses, because there's probably a variety of work that they do differently with each nurse. When the cycle times are long for the job covered by the study. So again, for our flashlight assembly or our car assembly in the lab, work sampling is not really appropriate because we want to get the exact time it takes to complete that task. With work sampling, we're looking at the broad categories to see what are the next steps that we would take to make some improvements. And then for non-repetitive cycles as well. Okay, so what I'd like you to do then is think about work sampling in terms of your project. So how could you set up a work sampling plan for your project? And if you absolutely don't have any ideas of how it might be appropriate for your project, like what categories, would there be machines or people that you would be looking at, and the types of categories, then number one, talk to your coach or myself and we'll see if we can help you out. But if not, you can think of something else, like the classroom example that I gave prior. Students in past have looked at the fish bowls in the library, different things like that. So what I want you to do is, and you can do this by yourself or with your group, but answer these questions. Over what time period would you need to perform the work sampling analysis in your project to adequately represent the different types of activities? So would a day be correct? Would a quarter be correct? Would a year be correct? I'm not saying we're going to have time to do that, but what would be the appropriate time and why? What subjects would you be sampling? Would it be people, machines, and what type of people, the teacher, the students in the classroom example I gave you, or what type of machines? Any machine in the shop or a particular type of machine, like only the lathes, but not the mills. And do you have any jobs in your project that have long cycle times? And if not, then what's an example if there isn't one in your project? Are there any non-repetitive work cycles in your project? And if not, then what is an example of that? Maybe from the classroom example or the library fishbowl or something like that. Okay, and so bring that and we'll use that as a talking point because you are going to have time in class to fully develop a work sampling plan, hopefully for your project, but for something when you come to class. So to design a work sampling study, the steps are listed here. We need to define the need for the study and the type of activity data to study. So in the video that you watched, the need for the study was that the nurses' time seemed to be, they were stressed out, overworked, and we needed to see if there was something we could do to help that. And the type of activity then we would need to do logically from that is how are the nurses spending their time? So we did some preliminary observations to get a list of how their time is spent so that we could go out and do the official study. And then secondly, you'd want to gain support and cooperation, just like we talked about in a direct time study. If you go out and start collecting data and making observations without talking to people, the area supervisors, the worker themselves, they're going to wonder what the heck is going on. Think about if you were in that position, right? So you'd want to understand why you're doing it and that it's always for improving the workflow and improving the work environment and that type of thing. So both with the manager of the area and the workers in the area. And then you want to design the study. So the preliminary list of categories, you could be just from what your prior observations had been. You could spend a little bit of time observing. Maybe that's a way of gaining cooperation and support is include the people to get what types of categories, how they spend their time, or the categories of time that the equipment is spent. Then you finalize the list of those work activities after a couple observations in a trial run. Determine the number of observations. There is a way that we can compute that to have some statistical significance. We're not going to worry about that right now. So for your purposes of the analysis you're going to do, 20 to 30 observations would be a good start. And in general, that's going to be a good takeoff. And we'll talk about that more later, why doing more would be better, but that takes time and costs money and prevents you or takes longer than to identify areas of where you can make some improvement and actually make an impact. And then fourth is determine the observation logistics. So given how many observations you need to take, how are you going to distribute those over the course of the study? So if I have 100 observations that I'm going to do, and I need to do them over the course of a 5-day week, then that means I'm going to do 20 a day, and that's roughly 3 to 4 an hour, right? So how you would distribute the observations over the weeks and the days. And then document the route the observer will follow. So that was also talked about in the video about the nurses. This is an instantaneous observation. It's not that you stand there and look for a few minutes and say, oh, this, that, or the other is going on. It's a particular spot, an instantaneous observation. So that's what you would need, and need to know where is that instantaneous observation going to take place at. And then design data collection forms. And a check sheet is probably the best way to go about that, and I can talk about that in class, but it would just be a list of what the work activities are, and then you just make a little hash mark for every time that you saw that activity happening, and have a different column for each day or time that you went through the route. Okay, so that's the observation logistics. And then you go out and then actually collect the data. Random times is what's key here. It needs to be spread randomly. You can use a random number generator on your phone or on your computer. There's a listing in the textbook that is on reserve in the library, but it needs to be random times. For example, if we did the classroom studies and we always looked at 5 after the hour, we're not going to find as good of information as if it's randomly spread throughout the hour, right? Because at 5 after the hour, most classrooms are empty, because that's typically when we have our 10-minute break exchange between classes. So you need random times through the day. And on a machine, maybe machine maintenance happens always at 30 minutes after the hour, or is always at 2:15 in the afternoon, right? So if you're doing it across the day, you need random times during the day and throughout the week. And then I already said it needs to be instantaneous observation, not what is going to happen a minute or two after you've been there, but the second that you get there. And then we analyze the study results and make recommendations of that. So as I said, work sampling doesn't necessarily give us the answer to the problem, but it gives us data to know where to go look to make some further improvements in the area. Okay, and you're going to design a work sampling study for your project, hopefully, or if not, you can come up with some ideas, or your coach or I can work with you, and then you're going to actually conduct a work sampling study, meaning you're going to go and collect data, do all this, and then we're going to have time in class to analyze the study results and make recommendations based on that. And then lastly, defining the activity categories. They need to be consistent with the objectives of the study. So it needs to be about the machine or about the nurse, and what they're actually doing, not what you wish they were doing or what they hope they were doing, but what is actually happening. Another thing, because they're instantaneous observations, they need to be immediately recognized. So if you're thinking about doing a classroom observation, are you going to be able to tell that the teacher is lecturing using the board? Are you going to be able to tell from instantaneous observation without asking that the students are doing individual work versus group work? So you need to be able to identify those just by a glance, not having to ask questions and that kind of thing. And then it's helpful to limit the number of categories to 10 or fewer. And we'll talk about that in terms of data accuracy as you go through, as we go through the example problem, and as you go through the analysis, the study you're going to do for your project. But really, probably 3 to 5 categories would probably be more than adequate for the practice that you're going to do in the work sampling study. So here's just another example of more categories and how you can expand them or shrink them up. So machine working could just be a category, right? You could have machine working, machine idle, and if you're looking at machines, maybe that's enough. Or you could take machine working and break it down into setup, producing, and maintenance. You could take machine idle and break it down into waiting for material, waiting for operator, and no work scheduled. So it's up to you on how you want to identify what the categories are. And maybe you have all of the working ones listed out, but it's just machine idle is your 4th category, for example. And then the same thing with worker working or worker idle. And you can see a whole bunch of list of things that are happening when the worker is working. You might want to, as part of your analysis, think about which of these are value added, which of them are non-value added and necessary, or just non-value added and wasteful that you'd want to get rid of, thinking back to the types of waste that we started the quarter with. And then worker idle, same type of thing. And the thing to think about always is, would you be able to easily identify each of these detailed categories? Because remember, it's an instantaneous observation as you're going out there through the path of the study. Okay, so that completes our first video in the work sampling series, where we defined what work sampling is and talked about how to actually set up and conduct a study. Thank you.